Thursday, June 1st, 1989, Tiananmen Square. Third day since the erection of the Chinese Statue of Liberty by the Tiananmen students. Just as interest was waning in the student movement 3 days ago, this statue was unveiled and drew a crowd of approximately 1 million curiosity seekers, and primarily citizens came in here to stare and take pictures of the statue. On Tuesday evening, needless to say, the government is rather upset about the position of the statue in the square. As they say, it's taking the place of where they normally hang the picture of Sun Yat-sen on special days. Today is the National Children's Day, and they're expecting to have ceremonies in here for that. This moment, the color guard is bringing the flag in for the daily raising of the flag over the square. This happens at sunrise every morning. Being raised automatically by a motor-driven system. Background music is not part of the ceremony.
内学生请注意，场内学生请注意，进入场内一律凭学生证，若没学生证。
The strength of their spirit in the midst of a brutal slaughter. Reports out of Beijing put the death toll from yesterday's army attack on Tiananmen Square at between 1,400 and 3,000 people. But as the army patrols the streets of Beijing, defiant citizens are back once again confronting the soldiers head-on. Protesters threw firebombs at army tanks today in downtown Beijing. And on the outskirts, students at 2 universities are bracing for troop movements toward their campuses. CNN's Mike Chenoy is in Beijing. He joins us live now by telephone. Mike.
At this hour, outside Tiananmen Square on the main approach road, groups of protesters are again in the streets. Clusters, 30 or 50 people stand around, some of them just a couple of hundred yards away from the 2 single lines of troops which block off access to Tiananmen Square from Chang'an Boulevard, the main road into the square. At this location, there has been sporadic throughout the night, the troops periodically opening fire to scatter the demonstrators, but the demonstrators dispersing just far back enough to regroup and then move forward again. The kind of cat and mouse game, the deadly cat and mouse game, in which there are continued casualties. The casualties from the massacre on Saturday night continue to mount. We do not have exact numbers. The hospitals are reported full of victims. There are estimates that range anywhere from 1,400 to possibly as high as 2,500 or even 3,000 dead. There are many people unaccounted for. One of the uncertainties, persistent reports that the Chinese military used trucks to load up corpses and drive them to the Baobaoshan cemetery on the outskirts of the city where the bodies were cremated, thereby obscuring the final death toll. What happened in Tiananmen Square on Saturday night has sent shockwaves throughout the city. The spectacle of the Chinese military turning guns on its own people after weeks in which the government promised this would not happen, and the government saying the People's Army loves the people, has absolutely stunned the city. There is a mood of tremendous anger and bitterness among the citizens here over what has happened. Many, many people here know people who have been killed or injured during the massacre. There is talk of revenge. There is talk that those who died, those who were wounded will be avenged by attacks on the soldiers. It is widely felt that soldiers moving around the city in small groups or in, for example, are at risk from mobs of enraged citizens. On the Statue of Liberty replica that the students built was destroyed by the troops, and the protesters who burned buses throughout the night, occasionally launching cars towards the troops, continue in the streets. On the university campuses, there is mounting fear that the next military push after the crackdown into Tiananmen will be in the northwestern part of Beijing, where the main campuses are located. Students there are making preparations for such an assault, some of them talking about resisting such an assault, others being urged simply to stay in their dormitory rooms and remain calm. There have been reports of troop movement in the northwestern sector of Beijing, but up to now we have no reports of the military actually planning to enter the campus yet, but that could well be the next step.
All right, Mike, Rick Moore in Atlanta, if you can hear me, your broadcast by telephone is breaking up. If you have a better line that you can talk to us on, consider doing that at this moment. Otherwise, we will be switching back to you by telephone in a moment. Let me ask you, if you can still hear me, the Reuters wire is quoting a broadcast, radio broadcast there in Beijing this morning that said, China's military said Monday, the bloody capture of Tiananmen Square from pro-democracy protesters was, quote, just an initial victory, and predicted a long fight against, quote, dregs of society. Mike, if you're with us, what do you make of that?
I think there are a couple of possibilities, Rick. One is, as we were just talking, it does seem quite likely that the military will attempt to move to crush the remaining bastions of resistance centered in the campuses, the northwestern part of Beijing. And this broadcast appears to be a clear warning that some move of that sort is in the offing. It's interesting, with the military having taken control of Tiananmen Square in a very, very bloody manner, they still do not have effective control of much of the rest of the city. And there have been roadblocks and barricades and crowds out in many, many other places. You're watching here scenes just before the final bloody crackdown on Saturday night. So the military has its job cut out for it in reasserting control over the whole city. It appears that's the word. Additionally, that may imply some kind of political struggle against moderates in the senior leadership who oppose the crackdown, lost in the horror over the slaughter and massacre of the last day and a half, has been the internal political fighting at the top, which in many respects appears to have precipitated this crisis. In fact, some analysts here believe that the crackdown on Saturday night may have as much to do with resolving that internal political dispute as with actually clearing Tiananmen Square. These analysts arguing that for the past 2 weeks, the hardliners in the leadership had not been able to line up enough support to manage to get rid of the Liberal Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang. The charges against him were simply unconvincing, and that this line of reasoning suggests the hardliners may have actually engineered this incident by first sending some smaller units of troops against the students on Friday night and earlier on Saturday, who were pushed back, this in order to justify a more massive attack, which the government has labeled a counter-revolutionary rebellion to overthrow socialism in China. And now the hardliners may attempt to use that charge to bring down Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang and those around him. So the Army's warning suggests more crackdown in the streets and possibly a deeper shakeup at the top. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see on that. Chinese politics remains, even now more than ever, a murky and obscure situation for us to draw out in any great detail.
All right, Mike, thanks so much. We'll be checking back with you shortly. CBS reporter Richard Roth and cameraman Derek Williams have been released after 19 hours in the custody of Chinese authorities. The two were arrested during the height of violence yesterday and suffered some rough treatment at the hands of police. But Roth says they were treated well during the time they were held. 8 other foreigners held along with them have also been released.
Many U.S. leaders are angrily denouncing those killings in China, and they're calling on President Bush to take more action than words. CNN's Patricia Ox has the story.
Washington has reacted with surprise and outrage at China's leadership for violently crushing student protests in Tiananmen Square.
I believe that Deng Xiaoping, in fact, finally controlled the situation on the basis of his longevity and the prestige that he had. It was the last roll of the dice, probably a fatal one, for the legitimacy of his government.
Experts say it will be impossible for China's aging leadership to bottle up the forces of reform.
They've been paralyzed politically, and they've acted militarily before even trying a conciliatory political approach. And that's, in effect, a bankrupt policy.
President Bush has said he deplores the crackdown in Beijing, but in an effort not to jeopardize Sino-U.S. relations built carefully over the past 2 decades, Bush has kept to criticism, not sanctions. There's a different tune in Congress.
I think the United States has to respond beyond condemnation. I've suggested that perhaps a meeting of the group of 7 of the economic leaders of the world get together and decide what should be done and what can be done, if anything.
Already some members are gathering support for legislation that could call for recalling the U.S. ambassador for consultations, ending transfers of high technology, changing U.S. immigration policies to allow Chinese students in the United States to remain until they are assured of no reprisals on their return to China, and cutting off military aid.
Would be politically unacceptable and morally unthinkable, Leslie, for us to continue selling arms to a country which is engaged in the wanton slaughter of its own people.
And I'm going to start tomorrow morning in the Senate to line up bipartisan support to cut off all of that sort of thing. It's folly, and we need to stand with these young people who are trying to achieve freedom.
Where the president goes from here will depend in part on whether force is again used to quell any Chinese discontent. The administration will be keenly watching the situation as it unfolds. Patricia Ox, CNN, Washington.
And later on Prime News, we'll take a look at more reaction to the violence in China, and we'll talk with an expert.
And U.S. City with the Chinese consulate. Thousands crowded in front of the consulate in Los Angeles, where students left signs and flowers on the doorstep of the building in memory of dead friends and relatives. In Washington, some 2,500 protesters rallied outside the Chinese embassy, and in New York City, a number of smaller, peaceful protests changed into a mass pro-democracy demonstration. CNN's Christiane Amanpour has that story.
The demonstrators started gathering shortly before noon outside the Chinese consulate. The first few hundred quickly swelled to 2,000 students, shaking their fists at the officials peering at them from inside, waving banners and yelling slogans denouncing the Chinese government. The protesters are mostly Chinese students studying at universities around the Northeast, and they have come from miles around to vent their anger at the bloodshed back home.
We are trying to show the people, the government, that the Chinese students, all the Chinese students, are extending unanimous support of the Chinese people. We are expressing our deep grief for the dead, for the martyrs.
While some are angry, others are tearful, unable to believe their government would unleash the army against its own unarmed people.
I can't believe it. I'm going to be so ugly like that.
A few hours later, the growing group of demonstrators marched along the streets of New York to the United Nations. By this time, their numbers had swelled to about 6,000. They came to deliver a letter to the Secretary General, asking him to convene an emergency session of the Security Council in order to condemn Beijing for crushing the democratic movement.
Americans, join us, George Bush, speak up!
Another gathering at Columbia University brought hundreds more students out for a vigil. Sitting quietly, they held a few moments' silence in memory of their fallen comrades. Calling Tiananmen Square a holy land running with blood, these students issued a warning.
The use of power only demonstrates the weakness of the dictators. We want to tell you, dictators, we will fight until your demise.
The students also called on the U.S. and the rest of the international community to impose stiff sanctions against Beijing as long as it continues to meet people power with military might. Christiane Amanpour, CNN, New York.
Joining us now in Washington is Harry Harding, a senior fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution, and he is an expert on China. Thank you, Mr. Harding, for coming by. Do you think that this is the beginning of the end for the China regime for taking this decision to kill those students?
I think it's the beginning of the end of the leadership that ordered it. It is still probable that the Chinese Communist Party will continue in power under new leadership. I don't know how long the present leadership is going to stay in power, but of all the scenarios, and this is an extraordinarily fluid situation, I think the one that's the most likely is that eventually we will have to see a new government come to power that will be prepared to repudiate what has been done in the streets of Peking and begin again the process of political reform.
Is the Communist Party especially sullied in all of this, or is it more of a personality?
I think that the longer this kind of thing goes on, the harder it is for the party itself as an institution to escape responsibility. Basically, we have a situation in which a small number of elderly men are able to make decisions without being overseen or corrected, but without being responsible, in other words, to collective party institutions. And I think that the Chinese people will ask the same question about the present situation that they asked about the Cultural Revolution. That is, why could not the party as a whole stop the insanity of a few of its leaders?
Fears are being expressed, we've heard it from reporters and others in Beijing, that next the soldiers will move against the campus centers where the students have been operating from. What will that do?
What I'm afraid of is that it will produce more martyrs. I have very close friends who live on those campuses, very close Chinese friends. I'm very, very concerned about their safety, obviously. It is at a minimum possible that if the troops move in, it will be to arrest student leaders for trial and punishment of some kind. Hopefully, we will not see the indiscriminate use of violence that has plagued the streets of Peking, of downtown Peking, in the last few hours.
We saw President George Bush return from triumph in Europe to shouted questions on the White House lawn today, not about that triumph of foreign policy in Europe with NATO, but what are you going to do about China? The president is under increasing pressure from Congress, especially the Senate, to get tougher. Talk to us about some of the possible ramifications now in U.S.-Chinese relations. What will be changing? Where will the squeezes be coming?
Well, I think that the first thing to remember is that this is an extraordinarily broad-based relationship now after 10 years of normalization, 10 years of an open door between our two countries. So I think the impact is going to be seen first in the non-official relationship. Already academic exchanges are being canceled, tourist groups are being postponed. I think that the American business community is going to think twice about making additional investments in China. And that's all without regard to what the executive branch or the Congress decide to do.
Should we have about 30 or 40 seconds left, should we recall our ambassador immediately?
I think that might be premature. I think certainly we should speak out forcefully. We should suspend further relaxation of technology controls, further new military agreements, and look for longer-term developments.
Could we, with moral good conscience, continue to sell weapons?
I would find it very difficult to do so.
Thank you very much. Harry Harding from the Brookings Institution. We'll be back with more news right after this.
Well, we're right over the target right now, Emperor. If you'd just like to...
This is in the Canadian Embassy, June 6, 2 p.m. We've been registered in 2 hotels today.